This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, it's Tracy DW back for another episode of Stories to be Told, the podcast series. I heard the same information through the international news networks that everyone else had heard and was as shocked as everyone else to hear about the remains of 215 children that were discovered at Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, and also the discovery of 715 unmarked graves at the Marieville Residential School in Saskatchewan. It is sad to know that these were just two of 130 residential schools established across Canada during the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries. These schools formed part of a wider system with the purpose of erasing the identities of the indigenous population of Canada and assimilate these groups into the culture and values of the Europeans who had travelled to Canada, dominating the country with their own settlements, governments and church authorities during the previous 5 centuries. As the rest of the world learns more about these residential schools, it's revealed that these places were poorly built, poorly heated, and proper sanitation was non-existent. Such crowded and harsh conditions caused the deaths of many children. Are these unmarked graves and remains the tip of an iceberg? Like South Africa at the end of the apartheid era, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission which was established in 2008, an official body whose role is to reveal the past wrongdoings of a government or private organisation in an attempt to address past wrongdoing. This was a process of catharsis for all survivors of such atrocities to share their stories, speak their truths, and exercise their right to justice. My decision to use this subject as a focus for a podcast was firstly a personal one. I was actually surprised by myself that I had not written a story about Canada or even referred to it as a British colony in any podcast episode up to this point. My only reference to this was through my podcast, The Book of Negroes, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia, which tells of the migration of Africans from New York to Nova Scotia after the American War of Independence from 1783 onwards. This subject really resonated with me as someone who has worked hard to educate and care for children throughout the years that I have been a teacher and a school leader. In today's educational settings across Britain, nurseries, primary and secondary schools are held accountable for ensuring that their environments, practices and culture promotes the safeguarding, well-being and personal development of all its pupils. Education is used as a force for good. It's not just about teaching curriculum subjects. So, when I heard about what had been discovered in Canada, I was sadly reminded of how education is also used to promote hidden agendas and other ulterior motives. This brings me to my second reason for focusing on this subject, which is of historical significance. That the story of colonialism was not just about discovering lands, establishing settlements, and expanding trade across the world. It was also about the division, enslavement of, and discrimination against the indigenous peoples of all those countries that were colonised, and that education was often used to promote this division, enslavement and discrimination in a systematic way. The discovery of these remains and unmarked graves in Canada is part of a wider narrative that tells of the injustices and acts of atrocities which were common throughout colonial times. It is a stark and tragic reminder that while we work towards an ideal of eradicating these injustices today, the reality is that, like those unmarked graves, the evidence of injustices never disappear. They just remain hidden. Over time, these become the whispers of constant reminders about our colonial past that eventually become exposed and expand into a scream, a rude awakening to realities which can no longer be ignored. This is the predicament within which the nation of Canada finds itself today. So let's get into some core knowledge. The colonial history of Canada follows the same pattern as those of other former colonies. Indigenous peoples descended from the Paleo-Indians had occupied the lands for thousands of years. In the 15th century, Britain and France fought with each other to colonise the country, and New France was formed in 1534, with the first French settlements established from around 1608. New France was ceded to Britain through the Treaty of Paris in 1763 and combined with the British province of Quebec, divided into Upper and Lower Canada in 1791. Both halves were unified in 1840 through the Act of Union, and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia were added in 1867 through Confederation. This created a self-governing dominion called Canada, which Britain recognised as a co-equal nation through the Statute of Westminster in 1931. Canada continued to expand, adding Newfoundland and Labrador in 1949. Placing this within a wider global context, throughout the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, Britain and France had continuously been at war for territory throughout the Americas, Caribbean, Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, was a key characteristic of this. As Britain's empire was growing, France also wanted to do the same through the ambitions of a young general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. However, due to the distraction of having their own revolution, 1789 to 99, and disposing of their own monarchy, French ambitions for a global empire were short-lived, with the sale of the Mississippi Basin, first to Spain in 1762, and then this, together with the entire area of Louisiana, sold off to America in 1803. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, resulted in the loss of not only an invaluable piece of French real estate, but also the loss of the lucrative streams of revenue which had accounted for almost half of France's wealth. After the Treaty of Paris, the British began to grant settlement rights to the remaining French settlers, known as Arcadians, who had decided to remain in the country. But what of the indigenous people? It was fascinating for my learning journey to carry out some research relating to Canada in its pre-Columbian times, such as the Hopewell indigenous Indians, with their sophisticated culture and traditions, who developed the Hopewell Exchange, a waterway system that connected many other Indian settlements around the Great Lakes. There were two main groups with their own distinct languages: the people of the Algonquian languages, residing around the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, Quebec, Ontario, Newfoundland and Nunavut, and those of the Nadina languages, who resided in what is now known as Alberta, the Northwest Territories, British Columbia, Yukon and Alaska. It should also be noted that these indigenous peoples went as far south as the Great Plains. As with any human population, migration was common due to many survival factors, and indigenous groups would often drive out other indigenous groups in order to occupy the same area. For example, the Dorset peoples who occupied the Arctic area were replaced by the ancestors of today's Inuit population, who are what we now recognise as the group of people called Eskimos today. So how did these residential schools come into existence? The answer probably lies in finding out how Western education and its religious systems came to Canada, and where the process of assimilation of the indigenous peoples with the French and British had its origins. Even though Canada and the Arctic North were some of England's first attempts at exploration to find a trade route to the Far East, England had never formally acknowledged a claim until 1583, when the settlements of Cupid, Ferryland and Newfoundland were established. The Scottish also began to settle there from around 1629. By this time, Henry VIII had already officially broken ties with Rome, declaring himself head of the English Church through the Act of Supremacy in 1534. European religion first took root in Canada during the French occupation. French exploration claimed Canadian land first in 1534 by Jacques Cartier, and the process of French settlement building began around 1608 with Quebec City. The ideology of assimilation firstly played out through warfare, as it did through the French and Indian Wars 1688 to 1763, as England and France battled over securing Canadian territory of the region around Hudson Bay, and further into the American interior as it became more important to establish forts and ports due to the lucrative fur trade. The indigenous population became embroiled with this European dispute, taking either the side of the English or French through trading agreements which inevitably led to taking sides in their wars. The Iroquois League were key allies to the English, while the Mi'kmaq and Abenaki population came to the aid of the French. A consequence of this act was for these French allies to convert to Catholicism as an act of confirming their solidarity with the French. And secondly, the process of assimilation saw warfare combined with religion, as the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuits gradually became a dominant force in the New France, hoping to establish a utopian European Aboriginal Christian community. Is this where the ideology of cultural assimilation found its origins in Canada? Well, this led to the establishment of Catholic missionary bases in New France, as many Indians saw religion as a refuge from the English, causing them to dislocate away from their own cultures and identity and assimilate more and more into the French culture. Despite English victory and the securing of New France through the Treaty of Paris, further dislocation resulted in the formation of the Seven Nations of Canada via the Confederation. These Indians became staunch Roman Catholic converts. The fact that these Indians ended up fighting for the English against the Americans in the American War of Independence and the War of 1812 shows a twist in the tale. A change in loyalty only worked to further tighten the hold of European control over the indigenous people of Canada, which would eventually cost them dearly. So, what's next for the indigenous population of Canada? Where do they go from here? At the time of producing this podcast, the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission were within the final stages of concluding their investigation, sharing their findings, and making a final judgment. What will the final judgments from this commission mean for Canada? Can reconciliation between the Canadian government and its Indigenous people ever be possible? If so, in what ways could this happen? And what can we do as individuals to become more aware and better educated about the effects of past wrongdoings and its consequences on today's former colonies? If you liked this podcast, you can listen to my other related podcast episode that I mentioned earlier, The Book of Negroes, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia. And finally, don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They are all available on the website in both ebook, Kindle and paperback formats. Feel free to like, follow and share us on Facebook, And don't forget to visit Stories to be Told for mini documentaries, timelines, learning journeys, videos, and also this podcast platform. So, once again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. Remember, history is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you again on the next page.